just sitting in the submarine, heading to the ocean floor to retrieve a broken metal cable. But the moment the searchlight swept across, there was a bizarre face pressed against the outside. No eyes, just a mouth full of curved, hooked fangs. That thick cable, which even a chainsaw couldn't cut through, was clamped in its mouth, snapped in two like it was chewing noodles. Then that pitch-black, bottomless maw slowly turned toward our sub. I heard a strange noise from the metal hull. The sound came up through the deck plates beneath my feet, sharp and piercing, like a steel nail scraping across an iron sheet. I was pinned under the overturned control console, my legs trapped, my whole body twisted and lying on the cold floor. My left cheek pressed against the ground, my right cheek facing the observation window. The observation window in front of me began to crack. This glass was supposed to be incredibly tough, able to withstand thousands of tons of water pressure, they said. But now cracks were spreading across it like a web, creeping from the corners toward the center. Every time a crack expanded, there was a crisp snapping sound, just like stepping on thin ice in winter. Shards of glass kept falling, rustling as they hit the metal frame of the console. Just then I saw that bizarre, enormous mouth. The sub's searchlight was still on, casting a pale, white beam straight ahead, landing right on the creature. It was pressed tight against the glass, so close I could see every single tooth in its mouth. The teeth were a chaotic mess, layered one over another, stretching all the way down its throat. Each tooth was curved and sharp, like the iron hooks used to grab cargo at the docks, glistening with a wet, cold sheen in the light. It had a big chunk of the undersea cable clamped in its mouth. I recognized that cable. Jim had told me before we set out that it was thicker than my waist, wrapped in titanium alloy wires and several layers of protective material. Even with professional hydraulic cutters, it would take a lot of effort to slice through. But now that sturdy cable looked like a glowing glow stick in its mouth. The cable was still live, with red and blue flashes sparking from the broken end, casting shifting red and blue light on the teeth inside its mouth. A dark, gooey substance oozed from the break, instantly dispersing into a black cloud as it hit the seawater. Its mouth gave a slight clench. There was no sound in the water, but I could clearly feel something was wrong. The whole sub lurched violently, like someone had slapped it hard on the top. The cable's light flickered, then the creature's throat moved, like it was swallowing, and the thick cable snapped cleanly in two. The cable broke into two pieces. One half was still clamped in its mouth, the other slowly spiraled downward. The red light at the break flickered a few times as it sank deeper, until it vanished completely into the pitch-black deep sea. It let go of the remaining half in its mouth, letting it drift slowly away. Then that massive mouth slowly turned. It aimed straight at us. I couldn't see any eyes on it. Its whole head was just that one huge mouth, a ring of sharp teeth and the dark, bottomless throat behind him. That black hole was facing me, facing the observation window, facing our entire sub. The console sank a little more, and a searing pain shot through my legs like my bones were about to crack. The outer alloy plates of the hull began to emit a screeching, eerie noise, so high-pitched it set my teeth on edge, like biting into a sour lemon. The creaking echoed continuously as the hull slowly compressed inward. The lights above flickered erratically. Mike was lying next to me, his face smeared with blood, muttering incoherent curses. Jim was huddled in a corner, his glasses askew, one lens already shattered, repeating the same phrase over and over, completely panicked. I caught what he was saying. He kept repeating, "The third layer of the hull's pressure resistance is completely gone." Another shard of glass fell from the observation window. The glowing cable in the sea was long gone. Now, in the pitch-black ocean, all that was left was the dying searchlight above, shining straight onto that massive mouth, the ring of teeth, and the bottomless black hole of its throat. The creature just hovered silently against the glass, motionless, waiting. I stared at it, and it seemed to stare back at me through that black void of a throat. The hull screeching grew louder and louder. To be honest, this whole thing fell off in the start. They sent us down in the deep sea stalker, and no one thought much of it at first. The mission was so simple, it was almost boring. A military undersea cable near Guam had snapped, and our sub happened to be in the area, so we were pulled in for the job. The process was straightforward. Dive to the bottom, find the break, hook it up, and let the mothership haul the cable back up with its machinery. Jim was the engineer on the boat, wearing thick glasses, always sticking his neck out, and talking like he was reading a manual, rambling on and on. He said the cable had a titanium alloy core, wrapped in special protective material, and then a layer of super tough wear-resistant fiber. He even bragged that even if sharks chewed on it every day, they wouldn't leave a single tooth mark. Mike was driving the boat up front, chewing on gum that had long lost its flavor. After listening, he chuckled and casually said it was probably an undersea earthquake snapped by rocks. Jim pushed up his glasses and added that it could also be a submarine landslide that broke it. I was listening in the back, so bored I was yawning. The descent took nearly an hour. When the searchlight shone out, all we saw were white flakes drifting around in the sea, nothing else. Those flakes fell like snow, endlessly, and staring at them too long made my eyes blur. Mike, with nothing better to do, was using the boat's mechanical claw to mess with a weird fish. The fish had a little lantern on its head, stupidly following the claw around as Mike toyed with it, secretly amused. Just then, the guy monitoring the sonar on the mothership suddenly spoke up over the intercom. He said a strange, big, dark shadow had appeared on the screen, quietly following us off the right rear of the boat, moving pretty fast, and his turns didn't look like they were caused by the water current. Mike casually flicked the control lever, unconcerned, and said it was probably a big whale that had wandered off course. He shifted his gum to the other side of his mouth and went back to playing with the fish. I didn't say anything, staring blankly at the row of monitoring gauges above my head. A small green light labeled hull pressure started blinking in a steady rhythm, on and off, completely out of sync with the tune Mike was humming. I watched it for over 10 seconds, and suddenly a chill ran down my back, my heart inexplicably racing. I called Mike over to take a look. He glanced up briefly and said deep sea pressure was naturally high, and instruments occasionally jumping around was normal. No need to freak out. Then he looked down and went back to playing with the mechanical claw and the fish. I didn't say more, but that little green light kept flickering at the corner of my eye, making me uneasy. When we finally sank to the seafloor and found the broken cable, even the easygoing Mike fell silent instantly. The searchlight clearly illuminated the cable's break. The cross-section was perfectly neat, as if it had been twisted off bit by a giant pair of pliers. The break had layered rings like steps, with a greasy sheen on the edges that shimmered with mixed colors under the light, looking deeply unsettling. This cable was thicker than my whole body, and something had managed to snap it clean. Jim reported back to the mothership over the intercom, his voice hoarse with fear. He said, judging by the marks, it wasn't natural damage. It looked like it had been cut. Mike didn't say a word, slowly maneuvering the mechanical arm to reach out and firmly grab the broken cable, the claw locking tight. Suddenly, a loud buzz filled my ears, and the whole submarine lurched violently, as if we'd hit something below. But the instruments clearly showed the seafloor was flat, with no reefs or cliffs. Then came a dull, heavy bang from above, a sound so deep it was terrifying, like someone swinging a sledgehammer and smashing something hard. Boom! All three of us looked up at the cabin ceiling. The lights went out instantly, went dark for a second, then blazed back on, blindingly bright. Right after that, a screeching, grinding noise started. It was right above our heads, just outside the submarine's metal hull. Screech, screech, like dozens of files scraping against the same iron plate at once. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but made my scalp crawl. I turned to look out the porthole. Pitch black, nothing visible, just the small patch of seawater lit by the searchlight and the cable gripped by the mechanical arm. Mike cursed under his breath and quickly pushed the control lever to move the boat away. But the submarine just shuddered slightly, then started slowly spinning in place, unable to stop. Jim shouted frantically into the intercom, his voice shrill with panic. Mothership! Mothership! The The rest was drowned out by the scraping noise outside. I saw my own face reflected in the window glass, pale as paper. The scraping above kept going, steady and rhythmic, one stroke after another, like something was slowly dismantling our home. We had no idea what was out there. Only one thing was crystal clear. It was right above us, and it hadn't left. Mike snapped out of it before I did. He cursed, shoving the control sticks forward with both hands and cranking the throttle to maximum. The submarine lurched violently, like a provoked bull charging ahead. Inertia pinned me to my seat, my ears filled with the deep rumble of the propeller, the whole vessel feeling like it was about to fall apart. The scraping sound outside kept pace with us. No matter how far we ran, that thing clung to the roof, impossible to shake off. Mac cursed again, yanking the control stick hard to the left, trying to throw off whatever was behind us. The submarine tilted sharply, sending everything in the cabin sliding to the left with a clatter. Jim lost his footing, slammed into the instrument panel, and his glasses flew off into the distance. I gripped the armrests tightly, my arms aching from the strain. But it was useless. We still couldn't shake the thing. The scraping sound on the roof suddenly changed. What had been a soft, rustling noise turned into harsh, grating creaks, like a can opener prying at the edge of a metal lid. I looked up at the ceiling. The curved alloy plate above us was slowly caving inward. I saw it clearly. The metal first dented in a small spot, as if struck by something heavy. The dent grew larger, the edges bulging inward with a continuous creak. When it reached the size of a fist, it paused for a moment. Then, another dent suddenly appeared to the upper left, right above Jim's head. Jim curled up in terror, scrambling into a corner to hide. Mac was still fighting with the controls, the submarine shaking like a sieve, the engine sounding strange, as if it could give out any second. Jim crawled on the floor, found his tablet, its screen glowing a harsh red. His hands trembled violently, his voice breaking as he spoke. Something's wrong outside. This isn't normal water pressure. In short, some unknown, massive thing was gripping our iron-shelled submarine from the outside. Just then, a sharp snapping sound rang out in the cabin. It was right next to me, like a thick rope suddenly breaking. Mac's hands let go of the control sticks. He froze in place, not shouting or screaming, just staring down at his right hand. I followed his gaze, and my heart sank. 2 fingers on his right hand were badly injured, sliced cleanly at the joint, the damage severe. The control panel had warped, pushing out a sharp piece of metal. The hull's deformation had caused internal structures to buckle, exposing a blade-like shard. Mac, focused on pushing the sticks, hadn't noticed and got cut. Mac looked at the wound for a few seconds, then immediately clamped his left hand around his right wrist, letting out a muffled groan. His face went pale, drained of all color. Blood poured from the wound, streaming down his wrist and dripping into the gaps of the control panel. I quickly unbuckled my seatbelt and lunged over. The boat was still rocking and tilting. I scrambled to Mac's side, grabbed my scarf, and wrapped it tightly around his wound, layer after layer. Soon, the scarf was soaked through with blood, warm and sticky to the touch. Jim snapped out of it and let out a loud scream. Usually quiet and composed, he was now hysterical, kneeling on the floor, clutching his head, and screaming uncontrollably at Mac's injury. Mac gritted his teeth and forced out through clenched jaws. Calm him down. Stop the yelling. I turned to Jim and shouted at him to shut up. Startled, Jim stopped screaming, shrinking into a corner, trembling, only letting out soft whimpers. The thing outside kept applying pressure, and 2 more dents appeared on the ceiling. The submarine's hull echoed with dull thuds, like someone pounding a giant metal drum from afar. Each thud shook the cabin, and the overhead lights flickered. I looked at the observation window. The cracks from before were still spreading, the glass slowly bowing inward. Mac braced himself against the control panel, trying to sit up straight, drenched in cold sweat, his lips trembling, but he still forced himself to focus on the instruments. The propeller's power was dropping, and the engine sounded increasingly wrong. He rasped, "The propeller's about to overheat." If we keep pushing, it'll burn out. He let go of the control sticks, and the submarine gradually slowed down. The scraping outside eased a bit. After 2 seconds of silence, the whole submarine suddenly plummeted. It wasn't a slow descent. It was a straight drop, like an elevator cable snapping. I felt a sudden weightlessness of my stomach churning. Jim was thrown off the floor, bounced up, and slammed back down. The pounding overhead became rapid, a barrage of cracks against the hull. The cabin lights went out instantly, and the emergency red lights flickered on, casting an eerie, terrifying glow throughout. Mac frantically pressed the console with one hand, and the thrusters roared back to life, desperately pushing the submarine upward. The vessel had already dropped a significant distance before it barely stabilized. I pressed my face against the observation window, peering outside. The searchlight was still on, its beams shooting upward. In the light, I could see a massive, blurry shadow floating ominously. It had a bizarre, irregular shape and was continuously contracting and swelling. With each undulation, it slammed violently against us, shaking the entire submarine. It was clearly trying to use its sheer weight to crush us into the depths of the ocean. The veins on Mac's arm bulged as he gripped the control stick with one hand, turning to shout at me urgently. Release the manipulator arm. Drop that cable section. It suddenly dawned on me that the manipulator arm was still tightly clutching the undersea cable. I stumbled to the console and slammed the release switch. The sound of hydraulic pressure releasing echoed from outside as the mechanical claw instantly let go. The submarine became noticeably lighter, buoying up slightly. But we had no time to catch our breath. The creature above us began attacking even more ferociously. It seemed to have realized we were trying to escape, doubling the force of its impacts, striking the exact same spot on the hull repeatedly. The dent in the ceiling deepened further, a long, jagged crack snaking across the metal plate, slowly spreading outward. Tiny metal fragments started raining down. First, fine dust settled on my shoulders. Then a triangular piece of metal broke free from the ceiling, crashing onto the console and shattering several buttons. Jim had fallen silent, crouched in a corner hugging his knees. His glasses were long gone, and he stared blankly at the crack in the ceiling, muttering over and over, "It's cracked. It's really cracked." Mac was still fighting, bracing the control stick with his injured wrist, using his other hand to adjust the submarine's balance, trying to halt the descent. But the thrusters were failing, sputtering intermittently. The external impacts continued, each strike targeting the weakest points of the hull. A single thought consumed me. We were like a tin can on an anvil, being relentlessly hammered. The hull was already deformed and dented. If this continued, the entire vessel would inevitably shatter. Suddenly, all the strange noises ceased. The screeching friction, the crushing pressure, the thunderous impacts against the hull all vanished in an instant. An eerie silence fell inside the cabin, broken only by Mac's heavy panting and the loud, frantic beating of my own heart. The red emergency lights still glowed, illuminating the dented bulge and jagged crack in the ceiling. Outside, the searchlight flickered twice, then steadied. We could see the ocean outside the window again. The light beam cut straight through the murky water, revealing nothing but emptiness in the distance. Tiny debris drifted lazily in the water, as if no danger had ever existed. We all thought the giant creature that attacked us had left. Jim was the first to speak. Trembling, he crawled out from the corner and picked up his tablet. Its screen cracked but still functional. After staring at it for a long time, he began analyzing the situation aloud as if lecturing a class. He suggested it was likely a previously unseen giant creature from the deep-sea trench, resembling an extremely hard-shelled crustacean. He explained that most deep-sea monsters are afraid of light and loud noises, and our thrusters and manipulator arm had probably provoked it into attacking. Now that it realized it couldn't easily overcome us, it had chosen to leave. He spoke with such seriousness, like a professor giving a lecture. I crouched next to Mac, listening while staring at the deformed ceiling. The alloy plate was deeply dented, with several deep scratches and curled edges. I thought to myself, our submarine was practically falling apart, hardly a formidable opponent, but I kept that thought to myself. Mac leaned back in his chair, his injured right hand wrapped in my neckerchief, now completely soaked with blood. His face was pale, his lips dry and cracked. Using his left hand to slowly sit up straighter, he hoarsely told me to fetch the first aid kit. I crawled to the rear compartment and retrieved the red waterproof medical kit, taking out coagulant powder and fresh bandages. As I reapplied the powder, it sizzled against the wound. Mac clenched his jaw, veins bulging on his forehead, enduring the pain without a sound. I carefully wrapped and tied the bandage. He looked down at his hand and said quietly, "We need to surface immediately. Jettison all ballast, even the manipulator arm." I nodded and went to find the lever for releasing the ballast. Jim was in the corner, fiddling with the communicator, repeatedly hailing the mothership. His voice still trembled, but he managed to speak clearly, repeating our approximate depth and the extent of the hull damage 3 times. The response from the mothership was intermittent, filled with heavy static, making it difficult to hear clearly. Still, it was a relief to finally get a reply, instructing us to surface as soon as possible and await extraction. I reached out and gripped the red T-shaped lever for emergency surfacing. The cold metal was slick with the sweat from my palm. And then, right at that moment, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a strange light outside the observation window. It wasn't the white beam of our searchlight, but an eerie blue-green glow, slowly rising from the deepest part of the ocean. I quickly turned my head, staring intently out the window. At first, the light was faint, like a glowing mist. Gradually, it grew brighter and expanded, slowly floating upward from the abyss. It didn't spread uniformly. Instead, numerous twisting lines of light lit up one by one, tracing an enormous outline. It reminded me of those connect the dots drawings from childhood. First you see the dots, then the lines connect, and finally a massive shape emerges. Its size was unimaginably vast, so vast that the entire area illuminated by our searchlight couldn't possibly contain it. My throat instantly tightened as it blocked, making it hard to breathe. Jim was still bent over, adjusting the communicator, while Mike sat with his eyes closed, leaning back his chair to recover. I tried to call out to them, but though my mouth opened wide, no sound came out. The blue-green light flowed slowly along its segmented body, brightening and dimming in a steady, rhythmic pattern, like a creature breathing calmly. Beneath the shifting light, I could vaguely make out dark, glossy plates of armor, like enormous scales pieced together. The edges of each plate were lined with dense, sharp spikes, their sinister outlines visible in the dim glow. Jim finally caught sight of the scene outside the window. The communicator slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. His eyes widened to their limit, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly as he stood there, utterly stunned. I remained crouched, my hand still tightly gripping the red lever, my entire body trembling with cold. In that moment, everything suddenly made sense. We had never left this colossal creature. We had simply fallen from its mouth and landed squarely on its back. All this time, we had been inside this iron submarine, resting on its body, quietly feeling its rhythmic breathing. We foolishly thought it had left, but it had never gone anywhere. It had just been lying there, completely still. Suddenly, the blue-green light erupted. What had been faint, outlined rays of light instantly blazed with a blinding intensity, dyeing the entire deep sea a sinister blue-green. The light shone upward from beneath us, piercing through the portholes and casting our faces in a ghastly, bloodless pallor. It was only then that I saw the creature for what it truly was. It had no head. Looking forward, there was no discernible head-like structure. The front part of its body was just a massive, dark, glossy carapace, segmented like a centipede or a lobster's tail. Each segment was large enough to fully contain our entire submarine. The edges of the plates were studded with spikes of varying lengths, the longest longer than my arm, curved and sharp as knives. These spikes were arranged in a precise, swirling pattern around the center of each plate, like a vortex. Along both sides of the carapace, rows of small holes were neatly aligned, and the blue-green light emanated from these openings. The light pulsed with its breathing, brightening and dimming in a steady rhythm. Each time the light flared, I could see layers of membrane deep within the holes, slowly undulating. As the light passed through, it took on that strange blue-green hue. The most chilling part was how it moved. It didn't swim like ordinary sea creatures. Suddenly, gaps in its armored shell opened, and rows of hook-like bony spikes extended out. These hooks dug fiercely into the seabed rocks, sending debris flying. Then its entire massive body contracted violently, propelling it forward with startling speed, skimming across the ocean floor. Despite its enormous size, it moved with terrifying swiftness, like an electrified serpent, darting forward from beneath us in an instant. Our submarine, perched on its back, was dragged along in a frantic rush. The cabin spun wildly. I was thrown hard to the left, my shoulder slamming into the metal wall, pain exploding behind my eyes. Jim was tossed into the air, his back hitting the ceiling before crashing down onto the instrument panel, damaging several switches. Mike clung desperately to a chair armrest, his injured right hand immobilized, the bandage slowly soaking through with fresh blood, dripping steadily. In an instant, the sound of scraping erupted from all directions, above, below, left, and right, a dense, rustling cacophony punctuated by the shrill screech of metal being clawed. On Jim's tablet, the submarine's structural diagram turned entirely red, with not a single patch of healthy green remaining from bow to stern. He lay sprawled on the floor, eyes wide, lips trembling uncontrollably, but I couldn't make out what he was muttering. Then came the piercing sound of cutting. Not a gentle scrape, but the brutal, deliberate slicing of metal, like a saw grinding through steel pipe. A harsh zayap echoed from the submarine's right side. I whipped my head toward the porthole just in time to see a dark shadow flash past. A razor-edged, blade-like segment of the creature's exoskeleton, skimming along the hull and carving a deep gash from front to back. The external camera feed on the right side instantly dissolved into static, the screen flickering before going completely dark. Before we could react, a hissing sound followed, hydraulic fluid leaking under pressure. The noise grew louder toward the rear of the sub. I turned to see the mechanical arm's hydraulic lines severed, spewing a mist of pale yellow fluid into the crushing deep-sea pressure. The oil dispersed into swirling clouds, quickly swept away by the current as it drifted past the porthole. The mechanical arm was now useless. What had once gripped the cable now hung limp against the hull, swaying with the sub's movements. Max saw it too. He grabbed the control lever, yanking it several times with no response. Outside, the arm twitched weakly, releasing another puff of yellow mist. He cursed under his breath and shoved the lever back into place. But the cutting didn't stop. The creature circled to the left side of the hull, dragging its blades across the metal 3 times in rapid succession. Asterisk Zayap, Zayap, Zayap asterisk, each gouge sending a shudder through the sub. The overhead lights flickered wildly, alternating between the red emergency glow and the harsh white main lights, casting the cabin in an eerie, shifting wash of crimson and pallor. Jim slowly sat up, no longer cowering on the floor. He leaned against the bulkhead, knees drawn to his chest. His glasses were long gone, his eyes slightly narrowed. The fear had drained from his face, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He watched the dents and cracks multiplying along the walls, silently counting each new slash the creature inflicted. I heard him whisper, 3rd one, 4th one. Mac snapped at him, "Stop counting." Jim paused, glanced at Mac, then turned back to the wall without another word, though his lips still moved faintly. Reading his lips, I silently tallied along. Asterisk 5, 6, asterisk the 7th cut was the most vicious. A shadow pressed down from above, dragging slowly over the observation window with a deep, grating screech. The entire sub trembled violently, and the crack in the ceiling stretched even longer. A small shard of metal clattered to the floor with a sharp ping. Then, a new sound emerged, a deep, resonant hum, rising from the abyss below. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unsettling intensity, vibrating through the metal floor until my legs tingled with numbness. Jim's tablet slid from his hands, landing screen up. A new window flashed open, displaying a cascade of plummeting red numbers. I couldn't read all the text, but it was clear the hull's integrity was rapidly deteriorating. Jim glanced down at the tablet, then up at me, bathed in the red emergency light. His expression was eerily calm, his voice flat. "It's dismantling the sub, piece by piece." I opened my mouth, but couldn't find words. He continued slowly. "It doesn't want to kill us outright. It just wants to grind this metal shell into something it can swallow." Mac let out a cold laugh, adjusting the thrusters with one hand. "Good luck trying to swallow us," he muttered through gritted teeth. The thrusters sputtered back to life, their sound ragged and uneven, like a dying engine struggling to turn over. The sub lurched forward slightly before stalling completely. The propellers spun uselessly. We were trapped. I pressed against the porthole, peering out. The spotlight tilted to the left, illuminating the creature's countless spines encircling us from every direction. Above, below, left, and right. Its massive body was slowly, inexorably tightening around us. "Surface!" I shouted. "Now!" Jim sprang up from a floor, like a tightly coiled spring suddenly released. No longer dazed or muttering to himself, he suddenly let out a loud, frantic scream. His glasses were long gone, and his previously squinting eyes were now wide open, the whites streaked with red veins. Stumbling over shattered glass and metal debris, he lunged toward Mike, his target the red T-shaped handle, the emergency release switch that would jettison all ballast and send the submarine rocketing to the surface. Pulling that handle would sever the cable connecting us to the mothership, causing the sub to ascend rapidly on its own. Normally, this was a last resort survival measure, but now if we disconnected, we'd be completely cut off. No signals, no guidance, no idea which way to go. Jim reached for the handle. Mike immediately shoved him back with his left hand, the force so strong that Jim staggered backward, slamming into the instrument panel before crashing to the floor. He looked up at Mike, bewildered, unable to comprehend why he was being stopped. "Are you out of your mind?" Mike's voice was so hoarse it was barely audible. The bandages around his injured right hand were soaked with blood, dripping steadily onto the control panel. "If we cut the cable, we'll have no direction. The thing could slam us into the seabed in one hit. If you want to die, don't drag us down with you." Jim lay on the floor, stunned for a few seconds, before suddenly breaking down into hysterical sobs. This wasn't ordinary crying. It was a raw, guttural wail. I'd only heard it once before, when a recruit in training broke his arm. Jim clawed at the floor, his nails nearly bending out of shape, babbling incoherently. "We never should have come down here. That thing isn't from Earth. It crawled up from the deep," spittle dribbling unnoticed from the corner of his mouth. Mike ignored him, turning back to adjust the thrusters with his left hand. The engine sputtered and wheezed like a broken-down truck on the verge of stalling. Just then, the cabin lights began flickering wildly. No longer a slow pulse. The red and white lights flashed back and forth rapidly, stinging our eyes. Shadows stretched and shrank erratically. Jim sprawled on the floor, Mike hunched in his seat, their distorted silhouettes shifting grotesquely under the erratic lighting. Then came the thunderous impacts from below. Rapid, heavy thuds like hail pounding on a tin roof. Each strike sent vibrations rippling through the metal floor, crawling on my legs. I pressed against the observation window, looking down. The creature's glowing blue pores were now ejecting something. No longer just light, but fist-sized black chunks, hurtling through the water like bullets, slamming into the sub's hull. Each impact produced a dull thud, the chunks shattering into fragments that scattered in the current. One grazed the observation window. I saw it clearly. This was no ordinary rock. Its surface was jagged, sharp as broken glass. Spinning rapidly, it screeched against the window, leaving a fresh scratch. It looked utterly lifeless, like industrial slag, yet the creature was using it as ammunition, pelting us relentlessly. Jim heard the impacts and abruptly stopped crying. He stared at the black projectiles streaking past the window, his expression shifting from terror to eerie calm. His tense body relaxed, his fists unclenched, the fear draining from his face as his eyes dimmed like a burnt-out bulb. He whispered something. Amid the engine's roar, the sub's violent shaking, and the relentless impacts, his words cut through clearly. "I want my mom." Then he reached for the buckle of his seatbelt. We'd been strapped in since the dive. One press of that release, and all restraints would come undone. A sharp click, and the belt snapped open. Mike turned just in time to see it. He opened his mouth to yell, but a barrage of impacts erupted outside. The sub rocked like a swing, and I barely held onto my seat to avoid being thrown. Jim, now unrestrained, tumbled across the cabin, his head smacking against the wall before rolling under the instrument panel. Mike slumped against the control chair, his body slowly tilting to one side. He had lost too much blood. The bandages I had wrapped earlier were already soaked through, droplets of blood falling onto the console and pooling into a small puddle. His eyes were half open, as if he wanted to curse, but he didn't even have the strength for that, barely managing to prop himself up with the armrest. I took in the scene before me. Mike was so weak he could barely hold on. Jim was curled up motionless in the corner. The crack in the hull above us was growing longer by the second. The black chunks were still hammering against the bottom of the sub, and the fractures in the observation window were silently spreading outward. But at that moment, my mind suddenly cleared. Attempting to surface now would be suicide. The creatures had us surrounded on all sides, their spikes pressed tightly against the hull. If we cut the cable and tried to ascend alone, we'd only be launching ourselves straight into their jaws. But staying put wasn't an option either. A few more hits from those chunks, and the observation window's glass would shatter. Once that happened, the immense pressure of the deep sea would crush us instantly, without even a moment to react. I glanced at the console and noticed that one of the mechanical arm controls was still lit green, still functional, while the other had long since broken down, completely useless. I pushed myself up from the floor and rushed to the console, squeezing past the weakened Mike, gripping the working mechanical arm controls with both hands, one for vertical movement, the other for the claw's grip. I peered through the observation window. The mechanical arm's claw was still firmly clutching the severed undersea cable, its exposed metal wires faintly glowing in the water. Suddenly, I remembered the earlier sight of the creature effortlessly biting through the thick cable. It relied on the contraction of its segmented exoskeleton to move, and it was especially vulnerable to hard objects. If something rigid got wedged between its plates, it would thrash violently in response. I pushed the control lever all the way forward, channeling the last of the sub's remaining power into the thrusters. The submarine lurched forward abruptly, its sides scraping against the creature's spikes with a grating screech of metal. I aimed for the gap between two of the creature's exoskeleton plates, where the blue glow was brightest. The plates flexed open and closed rhythmically, offering glimpses of the soft flesh beneath. Without releasing the claw, I maneuvered the mechanical arm. Using the sub's momentum, I drove the 3-meter-long severed end of the cable forward like a spear, thrusting it straight into the gap between the creature's pulsating plates. A deep, resonant tremor rippled through the water. The entire submarine shuddered as if struck from all sides at once. I was thrown backward, my back slamming into the ceiling before crashing back onto the floor. A deafening ring filled my ears, drowning out all other sounds. Only the heavy vibrations from the depths remained, traveling through the water and the hull, seeping into my bones like an invisible hand slowly tightening its grip. In that instant, all the impacts and scraping noises outside abruptly ceased. The tremors crawled up through my feet, settling deep into my bones. Before I could even catch my breath, the creature's growl suddenly changed. The sound became sharp and piercing, no longer the distant rumble of thunder, but a shrill, alien shriek I'd never heard before. It wasn't just in my ears, It exploded inside my skull, agonizing. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The noise cut straight through, drilling into my brain. Jim was on his knees, also covering his ears, his mouth wide open as if screaming, but I couldn't hear a word. Mike was slumped in his chair, his head thrown back, the veins in his neck bulging grotesquely. Outside the porthole, chaos had erupted. The creature's glowing blue pores were no longer pulsing rhythmically. Instead, they flickered wildly, erratically, their usual blue-green hue shifting to a sickly pale yellow. The pores contracted and expanded uncontrollably, each movement releasing a cloud of dark, murky fluid that dispersed into the water, turning the surroundings into a filthy haze. The next moment, the entire submarine was violently flung aside. It was as if a giant had grabbed our metal can and hurled it with all its might. I was thrown from the console, the seatbelt digging painfully into my chest, my ribs screaming in protest before I was yanked back. My head struck the metal edge of the console, my vision flashing black. When I came to, my sight was filled with swirling stars. The submarine tumbled and spun uncontrollably through the water. At times, the view outside the porthole showed the murky seawater above us. At others, it was a direct, unsettling gaze at the rocky seabed. The cliff walls loomed terrifyingly close, close enough to make out the white, tubular creatures extending from the crevices, standing eerily in the water like grotesque sentinels. Amid the relentless tumbling, Jim was flung from left to right, spinning midair before his back slammed into the ceiling and he crashed heavily to the floor, rolling several times before coming to a stop. One of his arms twisted unnaturally, and he lay sprawled on the ground, too weak to even scream, only emitting muffled, guttural noises from his throat. Mac, though strapped in at the waist, was thrown violently with each roll, his upper body flailing uncontrollably as his head repeatedly struck the seat. During one violent spin, the bandage on his hand caught on a jagged piece of metal and was torn loose, reopening his wound. As his body jerked, blood splattered across the cabin. I wiped my face absently, my hand coming away slick with warm, sticky fluid. The thrusters struggled to function, emitting a strained, faltering whine. Occasionally, as the submarine rolled, the thrusters would manage to stabilize it for a second or two before another external force sent it spinning again. Seizing a brief moment of stability, I pressed myself against the porthole to look outside, and there I finally saw it in its entirety. The creature had emerged from the seabed silt, its segmented carapace opening and closing incessantly. When the plates parted, I glimpsed its sickly pale flesh beneath. When they snapped shut, the jagged edges collided with a sound that set my teeth on edge. Its entire body convulsed in waves, each spasm growing more violent as it reached the spot where the cable was lodged. The 3-meter-long cable remained firmly wedged between two sections of its shell. The gap had been forced wider, the edges of the carapace splintered unevenly, the cable's end buried deep in its flesh. With every thrash, gouts of blue-green fluid oozed from the wound, dispersing into the water and staining the surrounding sea with an eerie, glowing hue. It was clear the creature was in agony. I watched as it hurled itself recklessly against the seabed rocks, ignoring its own injuries. It arched its massive body and slammed downward, its hardest carapace colliding with the black stone. The force of the impact reverberated through the water, jolting the submarine upward. The unyielding rock shattered, debris scattering and clanging against the hull. The creature's own shell cracked, more the glowing fluid seeping from the fissure. Yet it didn't stop. Again and again, it coiled and struck the rocks. With each collision, unsecured objects inside the cabin flew wildly. Jim was tossed across the floor, the screws holding the seats in place screeching under the strain. One even sheared off entirely, rolling into a corner. Suddenly, every alarm in the cabin blared at once, their shrill warnings merging into a chaotic cacophony. The control panel lit up with red warnings, and through the chaos, I barely made out the depth gauge, its numbers climbing rapidly. We were sinking, no longer spinning. We were now plummeting straight into the abyss. The creature's frenzied ramming had carved out a massive crater in the seabed, and we were sliding down its slope into even deeper waters. The depth gauge surged, 2,800, 2,900, 3,000, 3,100. The pressure outside mounted, the hull groaning under the strain. The titanium shell warped under the crushing force, the sound heavier than when we'd been ensnared earlier. The observation window, which had only a few cracks before, now webbed entirely, the fractures spreading visibly. The glass bulged inward, looking ready to give way at any moment. Soon, the numbers hit 3,300, 3,500. Max stirred from his daze, his eyes flicking to the depth gauge before locking onto mine. The red emergency lights cast his face in a ghastly pallor, his lips tinged blue, yet his gaze remained sharp. With his less injured left hand, he adjusted the control stick. The sputtering thrusters coughed, then roared back to life with renewed force. The submarine's descent slowed, then halted entirely. Gritting his teeth, Max steadied the controls as the thrusters fought to lift us. The depth gauge's numbers began to retreat. 3,500, 3,400. The entire metal frame of the submarine groaned under the strain, shedding fine metallic dust, but at least we were ascending. Then, abruptly, the light outside the porthole shifted. The blinding white glow dimmed for an instant before flaring back with even greater intensity. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, peering through my fingers to see the creature arch its massive body into a perfect, terrifying circle. Its gaping maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth, was now directly facing us for the first time. No eyes, no features, just concentric rings of fangs and the pitch-black void behind it. The mouth was large enough to swallow our entire submarine hull, and it was slowly opening toward us. Then, with a sudden jerk, it turned and slammed violently into the nearby undersea cliff. This wasn't just a collision, it was a full-force impact. The already damaged joint in its armored tail gave way, tearing off a massive chunk of its body. The severed piece, nearly half the size of our submarine, sank slowly into the water, trailing glowing fluid. Its jagged edges and twitching flesh were clearly visible before it disappeared into the abyss beyond the reach of our floodlights. The piercing screech stopped abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. The deep sea fell silent, leaving only the blaring alarms inside the cabin. My ears rang, and my mind went blank. Outside the porthole, the wounded creature, still entangled in the cable, swam away steadily but swiftly along the ocean floor. The glowing pores on its body dimmed from ghostly white to blue-green, then faded into faint specks before vanishing into the darkness. The floodlit water was now empty, save for swirling sediment and bubbles churned up by the propellers. It was gone. I collapsed into the control seat, my fingers frozen on the manipulator's joystick, trembling uncontrollably. My clothes were splattered with blood, my sleeves damp, my body drained of strength. Jim lay motionless on the floor. It took me a while to notice the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, though one leg was pinned awkwardly beneath the console. Mac leaned back in his seat, clutching his injured hand, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge. The numbers continued their steady descent as the battered propellers strained to push us toward the surface. Outside the porthole, there was nothing. No eerie glow, no monstrous shadow, just the white beam of the floodlight cutting through the murky water. The manipulator's claw still held the severed cable, its frayed end glinting faintly with a scrap of the creature's flesh as we ascended. We were alive, slowly rising. The red emergency ascent lever swayed before me, its T-shaped handle smeared with Mac's bloody handprint. I reached for it, missed, my fingers scraping against the cold metal. With a desperate lunge, I threw my weight into it and yanked the lever down. Outside, the bolts exploded. 3 muffled cracks echoed overhead like distant cannon fire. The cables tethering us to the mothership snapped. The submarine lurched upward, suddenly lighter, its nose tilting sharply toward the surface. During the ascent, my mind was foggy. My ears buzzed as if stuffed with wet cotton, muting all sound around me. I slumped against the warped hull beneath the console, staring blankly at the crack in the ceiling. Seawater seeped through, droplets clinging before falling onto my face, cold and sharp. Max sat beside me, eyes closed, breathing shallow and fast, his bandaged hands soaked anew with blood. Jim remained sprawled across the floor, his leg trapped, his arm pinned beneath him, his gaze locked on the ceiling, motionless as if petrified. Another drop of cold water fell from the crack above. When I came to again, the creaking of crane cables filled my ears. Our submarine was hoisted from the water, swaying slightly in midair. Seawater gushed from countless cracks in the hull like a punctured bucket. The deck was crowded, shouts, pounding footsteps everywhere. Someone pried at the sealed hatch with a crowbar, metal clanging relentlessly against metal. The door, warped and jammed, refused to budge. More hands joined in, and finally it gave way. A wave of stifling air, blood, oil, sweat, hit me as hands reached in and dragged me out. The sunlight outside was blinding. I couldn't open my eyes. Someone was helping me walk toward the large ship's cabin, and I couldn't resist turning back for one last look at our deep-sea diver. It was suspended on a cradle, with not a single smooth surface left on its entire hull. The shell was covered in dense, crisscrossing scratches, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, everywhere. Some grooves were so deep they revealed the metal layers beneath. There were also several round indentations, their edges curled inward, as if something had forcefully punctured them. I was assisted inside the larger ship, where a doctor was treating Mac's hand, rewrapping it with fresh white bandages. Jim lay on a stretcher, his injured leg already secured with splints. A man in civilian clothes crouched beside him, asking questions in a low voice, while Jim's lips moved faintly, his replies almost inaudible. Then I was taken alone into a small room. Inside, there was only a table, 2 chairs, and the incessant buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead. Across the table sat 2 men in plain clothes, who kept circling back to the same question. Had we been underwater too long? Had the deep-sea pressure messed with our heads, making us mistake an ordinary underwater landslide for something strange? I didn't answer. They rephrased it, conceding that the broken end of the cable did look like it had been torn apart by external force. But then they deliberately countered. How could anything at such depths bite through titanium alloy cables? They urged me to think carefully again. I picked up a glass of water, took a sip, and remained silent. One of them sighed and slid a photograph toward me. The image had a dark background, showing the salvaged section of the cable. At the broken end, a strange fragment was still attached. It was only the size of a wash basin, with a black, glossy, hard shell covered in fine, sharp spines along the edges. Beneath the shell was a layer of whitish flesh, slightly swollen from seawater, but with its texture still clearly visible. A ring of pointed, tooth-like structures remained intact on it. I stared at the photo for a long, long time. The small tear on the fragment looked fresh, clearly having split open not long ago. Slowly, I raised my head and looked at the 2 men across from me. One of them was also staring at the photo, his finger lightly tapping the edge of the tear, silent as the grave. The only sound left in the room was the monotonous hum of the fluorescent light, and in that moment, I understood everything. What we had encountered in the deep sea that day wasn't a fully grown, colossal monster at all. It was just one of its offspring,